Imagine you are standing in the middle of a silent, sun-scorched desert just outside Riyadh. The heat is a physical weight on your shoulders, and the horizon ripples with heat haze. For decades, this sand was just the crust sitting on top of the world's greatest treasure. Beneath your boots lies a sea of black gold that turned a collection of nomadic tribes into one of the wealthiest nations on earth. But then, the silence is broken by the roar of 1,000 bulldozers. This isn't a small construction site. It is the beginning of a $2 trillion gamble. Saudi Arabia is currently attempting the most ambitious economic pivot in human history. One shocking fact usually catches people off guard. They are building a city from scratch that is expected to cost $500 billion, which is roughly the entire GDP of countries like Belgium or Thailand. You probably thought the oil money would last forever, but the leaders in Riyadh aren't so sure. They are racing against a clock that is ticking louder every single year. The big question is whether you can actually build a future out of nothing but sand and sheer willpower before the world stops buying what's under the ground. For a long time, the deal in Saudi Arabia was simple. The government provided almost everything, and in exchange, the people didn't ask too many questions about how things were run. We are talking about a world where gas was cheaper than bottled water. There were no income taxes. If you wanted a job, the government usually found a spot for you in a massive bureaucracy. It was the ultimate cradle-to-grave welfare state, fueled entirely by the constant flow of oil through massive pipelines. But then came the year 2014. If you look at the charts from that era, it looks like a mountain climber falling off a cliff. Oil prices had been hovering comfortably above $100 a barrel for years. Then, almost overnight, the floor dropped out. The price crashed toward $30. In the high-ceilinged offices of the Saudi Ministry of Finance, the mood turned from confident to clinical. The math simply didn't work anymore. Imagine a family that earns $10,000 a month suddenly realizing their income has dropped to $3,000, but their mortgage and car payments are still $9,000. That was the kingdom's reality. The reserves were being drained at an alarming rate to keep the lights on. It wasn't just a bad quarter or a temporary dip, it was a structural nightmare. The global shift toward electric vehicles was starting to look real. Climate change talks were moving from the fringe to the mainstream. The leaders looked at the numbers and realized that if they didn't change, the kingdom would eventually go broke. This wasn't just about losing some luxury, it was about survival. Then came the moment that changed everything. In April 2016, a young prince named Mohammed bin Salman stepped onto a global stage to unveil something called Vision 2030. He didn't just suggest a few tweaks to the tax code. He proposed a total teardown and rebuild of the Saudi identity. The centerpiece of this plan was the Public Investment Fund, or the PIF. This was an old, sleepy sovereign wealth fund that the prince wanted to turn into the world's largest investment vehicle. The goal was to take the remaining oil money and spray it across the globe, buying up tech companies, sports leagues, and real estate. The dividends from those investments would eventually replace the money from the oil wells. When the announcement hit the news wires, the reaction in the West was a mix of shock and heavy skepticism. Wall Street analysts looked at the glossy brochures and the 3D rendered cities and wondered if this was just a massive PR campaign. It sounded too much like science fiction. They talked about non-oil GDP growth and female labor participation. For a country that was deeply conservative and totally dependent on one commodity, these weren't just goals, they were a revolution. The tension during those first few months was palpable. Inside the royal palaces, the old guard watched with narrowed eyes. They had spent decades managing the status quo. Now, this young leader was talking about selling a piece of Saudi Aramco, the crown jewel of the nation. It was like a family selling the farm that had fed them for generations. Meanwhile, on the streets of Riyadh and Jeddah, the reality of this vision started to hit home in a much more personal way. For the first time in memory, the government started talking about austerity. This is where the story gets really interesting for the average person living there. Picture a local gas station on a Tuesday night. For years, filling up a massive SUV cost about the same as a cheap lunch. Then, the government announced they were slashing fuel subsidies. Suddenly, the price at the pump jumped. It was still cheap by American standards, but for people who had built their entire lives around free energy, it felt like a betrayal. Then came the VAT. A 5% value-added tax was introduced on almost everything. For a population that had never paid taxes, this was a psychological earthquake. You could see it in the malls. People stood in front of electronics stores looking at the price tags and doing the math in their heads. The free ride was over. The government was essentially renegotiating the social contract. They were saying, we can't give you everything for free anymore, but we will give you a modern, vibrant country where you can actually have a career. It was a high-stakes trade. If the government took away the perks but failed to deliver the jobs and the entertainment, the domestic tension could boil over. There is a real disagreement on whether a top-down, state-mandated economic revolution can actually work in the long run. Some economists argue that you can't simply buy a private sector with a checkbook. They say that true innovation comes from the bottom up, through small businesses and competition, not through massive government decrees. Others point to places like Singapore or Dubai and argue that in this part of the world, the state has to lead the way because nobody else has the capital. The early days of Vision 2030 were defined by this friction. In boardrooms across London and New York, Saudi officials were pitching their vision to investors who were used to seeing these kinds of grand projects stall out. They heard about the Line, a city built in a straight line with no cars and no streets. They heard about turning the Red Sea coast into a luxury tourist destination that would rival the Maldives. It felt like the kingdom was trying to do 100 years of development in 15. The pace was frantic. New laws were being signed every week. Old religious police were being moved off the streets. The atmosphere in Riyadh was electric, but also incredibly nervous. Everyone knew the stakes. If the oil money ran out before the new economy was ready, there was no plan B. The desert doesn't give many second chances. One notable event that captured this transition happened at a massive investment conference dubbed Davos in the Desert. Thousands of suits from the world's biggest banks gathered in a luxury hotel. They were there for the money, but you could feel the hesitation. They were watching a traditional monarchy try to dress itself up as a tech-savvy startup. The conflict was clear. The world wanted the Saudi capital, but they weren't sure they believed in the Saudi dream. Every time a new project was announced, the skeptics would point to the empty patches of sand where these future cities were supposed to stand. But the bulldozers kept moving. The cranes kept rising. The kingdom had decided that it was better to risk everything on a new future than to wait for the old one to run dry. Now, shift your focus away from the crowded streets of Riyadh. Travel northwest toward the Tabuk province. This is where the red sand meets the turquoise waters of the Red Sea. For centuries, this area was mostly home to quiet fishing villages and nomadic tribes. But today, if you were to fly over this coastline, you would see something that looks like a giant scar being carved into the earth. This is the birthplace of NEOM. It is not just a city. The planners call it a living laboratory. It is the crown jewel of the entire $2 trillion gamble. The scale of what they are trying to do here is almost impossible to wrap your head around. Imagine a structure that is only 200 meters wide, but stretches for 110 miles in a perfectly straight line. They call it the Line. It is designed to be 2 parallel rows of mirrored skyscrapers, each 500 meters tall. That is significantly taller than the Empire State Building, and it is meant to house 9 million people. When the promotional videos first dropped, the internet went into a frenzy. It looked like a colony on Mars, just placed in the middle of a desert. The engineering meetings behind closed doors were likely filled with a mix of awe and pure terror. Think about the physics for a second. When you build a mirrored wall that is over 100 miles long, you have to account for the curvature of the Earth. You have to figure out how to keep a glass box in the middle of a 110-degree desert from becoming a literal oven. Engineers have spent countless hours debating how to move millions of people without a single car or a single road. The plan is a high-speed rail that can travel the entire length of the city in just 20 miles. But as the blueprints became more detailed, the friction started to heat up. Ecologists began raising the alarm about the environmental cost. This part of the Saudi coast is a massive corridor for migratory birds. Every year, millions of birds fly between Europe and Africa. Now imagine those birds flying at full speed into a 500-meter-tall mirror. It's a potential ecological disaster on a scale we've never seen. Then there is the water. The desert doesn't have any. To support millions of people, NEOM will have to rely on massive desalination plants. These plants suck in seawater, take out the salt, and pump out fresh water. But the leftovers, called brine, are a toxic sludge that can kill coral reefs if it's just dumped back into the ocean. The planners promise they will use circular technology to turn that waste into industrial minerals. It sounds great on paper. But critics point out that this level of tech hasn't been proven at this scale yet. Meanwhile, in the luxury hotels of London and New York, the Saudi team has been on a charm offensive. They are trying to convince the world's biggest tech giants to move their headquarters to the sand. Picture a sleek boardroom in San Francisco. A group of executives from a major cloud computing company is looking at a 3D model of NEOM. The Saudi officials are offering tax breaks that would make a CFO cry tears of joy. They are offering a special economic zone with its own laws, separate from the rest of the kingdom. This led to a wave of announcements. You saw headlines about memorandums of understanding being signed with companies like Oracle and various global green energy firms. But if you look closer at the fine print, an MOU is essentially a "let's be friends" letter. It isn't a check. Many of these tech giants are still standing on the sidelines, waiting to see if a single floor of the line actually gets finished. They are worried about the optics. They are worried about the long-term stability. Most of all, they are worried that they might be building an office in a ghost town. The tension reached a breaking point when the project moved from the dreaming phase to the digging phase. This is where the human cost of the vision started to surface. The land designated for NEOM wasn't actually empty. It was the ancestral home of the Huaytat tribe. Reports began to leak out about forced evictions and clashes between locals and security forces. One specific incident involving a tribal member who refused to leave his home became a flashpoint for international human rights groups. Suddenly, the city of the future was facing the same old-world problems. The kingdom's PR machine went into overdrive to smooth things over. They talked about the thousands of jobs the project would create for Saudis. They highlighted the scholarships for local students to study abroad and return as the new leaders of NEOM. But the shadow of the displacement remained. It served as a stark reminder that you can't build a $500 billion utopia without breaking a few things along the way. There is still a real disagreement on whether a city can be willed into existence without a natural reason for being there. Most great cities in history grew because they were on a major river or a natural harbor. They grew organically over centuries. NEOM is the opposite. It is a top-down, artificial creation. Some urban planners argue that without a natural soul, the city will just be a playground for the ultra-wealthy that sits empty most of the year. Finance people still go back and forth on whether the sheer amount of capital can overcome the lack of organic growth. They look at Dubai as the ultimate success story. 30 years ago, Dubai was a small trading port. Today, it's a global hub. Saudi Arabia is essentially saying, if Dubai could do it with a little bit of money, imagine what we can do with all of it. You can see the physical evidence of this ambition if you check satellite imagery of the region. The ground is being moved on a scale that is visible from space. The initial trenches for the line are being dug. The foundations for a floating industrial port called Oxagon are being laid. They are even building a ski resort called Trojena in the mountains of the Tabuk region. Yes, a ski resort in the Arabian desert. They plan to use man-made snow and the naturally cooler mountain air to host the 2029 Asian Winter Games. But the clock is the real enemy here. The kingdom is burning through cash to keep these projects moving. Every month that passes without a massive influx of foreign investment is a month that the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund has to cover the bill. One notable event occurred during a site visit for international journalists. They were taken to a base camp that looked more like a 5-star resort than a construction site. There were high-end gyms, gourmet dining halls, and rows of pristine cabins for the engineers. It was a show of strength. It was meant to say, we have the resources to make the impossible possible comfortable. But as the sun set over the desert, some of the visitors couldn't help but notice how small the actual construction looked compared to the vast, empty wilderness surrounding it. The drama of NEOM is a drama of the entire Saudi pivot. It is a battle between an unlimited checkbook and the laws of physics and economics. If it works, it will be the 8th wonder of the world. It will prove that in the 21st century, geography is optional if you have enough oil money. But if it fails, it will be the most expensive ruin in human history. A $500 billion wall of mirrors, slowly being reclaimed by the sand, reflecting nothing but the heat of a sun that the kingdom is trying so hard to outrun. While the bulldozers are busy moving mountains of sand in the north, another kind of construction is happening on your television screen. It is quieter, but arguably much more effective. If you were to flip through the sports channels lately, you might notice something strange. The logos are the same, and the stars are familiar, but the location of the action has shifted. This is the second pillar of the $2 trillion pivot. It isn't about glass and steel. It is about soft power. The kingdom is essentially trying to buy a seat at the world's dinner table by purchasing the world's favorite pastimes. The most explosive example of this happened on the pristine green grass of the golf world. For nearly a century, the PGA Tour was the undisputed king of the sport. It was a conservative, prestigious, and very American institution. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, a rival appeared. It was called LIV Golf, and it was backed by an almost bottomless pit of Saudi cash. They didn't just ask players to join, they backed up literal armored trucks of money to their front doors. Imagine you are a professional golfer who has spent years grinding for a few $100,000 in prize money. Suddenly, someone offers you $200 million just to show up. That was the reported deal for Phil Mickelson. Dustin Johnson reportedly took $150 million. These aren't just salaries. These are generational fortunes handed out before a single ball is hit. The traditional golf world didn't just get annoyed. It went into a full-scale meltdown. The tension in the air during those first few months was thick enough to cut with a wedge. You had legendary players taking sides. There were lawsuits flying back and forth in American courts. The PGA Tour commissioner spoke about loyalty and the soul of the game. Meanwhile, the LIV players were playing in tournaments that looked more like music festivals, with loudspeakers on the course and shorter rounds. Then came the moment that truly shocked the system. After a year of bitter legal warfare and public insults, the two sides reached a framework agreement to merge. It was one of the biggest, if you can't beat them, buy them moments in corporate history. Picture the scene in a high-end law firm in New York. On one side of the table, you have the defenders of golf tradition. On the other, the representatives of the Saudi Public Investment Fund. The details of the deal were kept so secret that even the players found out about it on Twitter. It was a cold realization for the sports world. No matter how much history or tradition a sport has, it usually has a price tag. And currently the kingdom is the only one with a high enough limit on its credit card. But golf was just the warm-up act. The real earthquake happened on the football pitch. For decades, the path to greatness for a football player was simple. You started in South America or Africa, you moved to a mid-tier European club, and you ended up at a giant like Real Madrid or Manchester United. Europe was the only place that mattered. That changed on a cold day in late 2022. Cristiano Ronaldo, arguably the most famous athlete on the planet, signed a contract with a Saudi club called Al Nassr. The numbers were staggering. Reports put his compensation at around $200 million a year. To put that in perspective, that is enough to pay for a fleet of private jets every single season. At first, people thought it was a one-off. They thought Ronaldo was just heading into a wealthy retirement. But then the summer of 2023 arrived. Suddenly, it wasn't just the legends in their late 30s moving to the desert. It was players in their prime. Karim Benzema, the reigning best player in the world, left Real Madrid for Saudi Arabia. Neymar, the Brazilian superstar, followed. The transfer window that year felt like a fever dream for European fans. You would wake up every morning to a new headline. Another star was leaving the Champions League for the Saudi Pro League. The vibe in the boardrooms of London and Paris was pure panic. They were used to being the ones who bullied other leagues with their wealth. Now, they were the ones being raided. A specific microscene captures this perfectly. Imagine the office of a sporting director at a top English Premier League club. He's trying to negotiate a contract extension for his star player. He offers a massive raise, maybe $300,000 a week. The player's agent just smiles and shows him a text message. A Saudi club is offering 3 times that, tax-free, plus a palace and a private jet. How do you compete with that? You don't. You just watch the plane take off. This spending spree wasn't just about winning games, it was about visibility. Every time Ronaldo scores a goal in Riyadh, millions of people around the world see the Saudi flag. They see the modern stadiums, they see a country that looks like a high-end vacation destination rather than a mysterious oil state. However, this strategy has triggered a massive global debate. Critics have coined a term for it, sports washing. The idea is that the kingdom is using the glamour of sports to distract from its record on human rights and its role in regional conflicts. This isn't just a Twitter argument. It has become a central part of the broadcast for every major event. There's still a real disagreement on whether sports washing actually works in the long run. Some analysts argue that it backfires. They say that by buying these teams and hosting these events, the kingdom is actually putting a giant spotlight on its flaws. Every time a Saudi-owned team plays, journalists write stories about the country's laws. On the flip side, some finance people argue that the strategy is working perfectly. They point to the fact that most fans eventually stop caring about the politics and start caring about the score. Look at Newcastle United in the English Premier League. When the Saudi fund first bought the team, there were protests and national headlines about ethics. Fast forward a year and the fans were wearing Saudi-style headscarves to matches and celebrating their new signings. The human desire to see your team win is a powerful tool for any government. The reach of this soft power campaign goes far beyond the grass of a stadium. The Public Investment Fund has also moved into the world of gaming and esports. They bought major stakes in companies like Nintendo and Activision Blizzard. They are building a massive gaming city near Riyadh. Why gaming? Because it's where the youth are. Over 60% of the Saudi population is under the age of 30. By investing in the things that young people love globally, the kingdom is attempting to rewrite its brand for the next generation. They want to be seen as the world's playground, not just its gas station. But here is where the tension comes back. This massive spending is all happening at once. The golf, the football, the gaming, the tennis tournaments. It's a multi-billion-dollar annual bill, and unlike an oil well, a football star doesn't produce a physical product you can sell. It's an investment in reputation. A notable event that highlighted this risk was the fallout from the 2034 World Cup bid. Saudi Arabia ended up as the only bidder, essentially securing the tournament by default after a series of tactical moves. While it was a massive diplomatic win, it also brought back the memories of the Qatar World Cup. It reminded the world of the immense pressure and scrutiny that comes with being a host. The kingdom is betting that by the time 2034 rolls around, the world will be so used to Saudi Arabia being a sports powerhouse that no one will think twice. But it is a precarious path. One major scandal or one geopolitical shift could turn these expensive athletes into very public liabilities. For now, the checks are clearing and the stars are arriving, but the drama isn't on the field, it's in the ledger. The world is watching to see if you can truly buy the love of a global audience, or if you are just renting their attention until the money runs out. While the world was busy debating the ethics of golf and football, a much quieter but more profound change was happening inside the homes and malls of Saudi Arabia. To understand why this matters, imagine you are standing in a bustling district in downtown Riyadh on a Saturday evening. For decades, this scene would have looked very different. You would have seen almost no women in the streets without a male guardian. The religious police would have been patrolling the sidewalks to ensure every shop closed exactly at prayer time. The air would have been heavy with a very specific, rigid kind of silence. But today, that silence has been replaced by the hum of electric cars and the sound of music pouring out of cafes. This isn't just a cosmetic makeover. It is a fundamental rewiring of a society that remained frozen in time for nearly 40 years. If you want to build a $2 trillion modern economy, you can't do it while keeping half of your population at home. This realization led to one of the most visible shifts in modern history. The most iconic moment of this transformation happened on June 24th, 2018. For decades, Saudi Arabia was the only country on earth where women were legally banned from driving. It was a global punchline and a major economic bottleneck. If a woman wanted to work, she had to spend a huge chunk of her salary on a private driver or a taxi. It made professional life almost impossible for many families. Then, at the stroke of midnight, the ban was lifted. Reporting at the time described scenes of pure jubilation. Women were driving their fathers and brothers around the block just for the novelty of it. But look closer at the economic ripple effect of that night. Suddenly, thousands of families had more disposable income because they didn't have to pay for a driver. More importantly, the labor market cracked wide open. Within a few years, the percentage of Saudi women in the workforce nearly doubled. They started appearing in roles that were previously unthinkable. You can now see women working as baristas, flight attendants, and high-level corporate executives. This wasn't just about civil rights. It was a cold, hard economic necessity. A modern country needs a two-income household model to survive the high cost of living that comes with a diversified economy. Meanwhile, another wall was coming down in the world of entertainment. For 35 years, there were no public cinemas in the kingdom. If you wanted to watch a movie, you had to fly to Bahrain or Dubai, or watch it on a pirated satellite feed. In April 2018, that finally changed. The first public screening in decades was held in a converted concert hall in Riyadh. The movie was Black Panther. Think about the sensory experience of that night. Imagine being a 25-year-old Saudi who had never experienced the smell of theater popcorn or the rumble of a professional sound system. People were dressed in their finest clothes just to sit in a dark room and watch a Hollywood blockbuster. It was a massive psychological shift. The government realized that if they wanted people to spend their money inside the country instead of taking it to Dubai, they had to provide something to do on a Friday night. The growth was explosive. Within 5 years, dozens of massive multiplexes popped up across the country. Global brands like AMC and Vox rushed in to capture a market that was hungry for Western culture. This shift wasn't without its critics. There were older, more conservative Saudis who watched these changes with deep concern. They saw the introduction of concerts and festivals as a threat to the nation's Islamic identity. But the government pushed through, betting that the younger generation's desire for a modern lifestyle would outweigh the traditionalists' objections. While these social walls were coming down, the Crown Prince was also busy tearing down the old political order. This leads us to one of the most dramatic and controversial episodes of the entire Vision 2030 saga. In November 2017, the world woke up to news that sounded like something out of a thriller novel. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the country were arrested and detained in the Ritz-Carlton hotel in Riyadh. This wasn't a normal arrest. These were princes, billionaires, and former ministers. People who had been untouchable for decades were suddenly being held in a luxury, gilded prison. The government called it an anti-corruption sweep. They claimed these individuals had siphoned off billions of dollars from the state over the years. The scene inside that hotel was surreal. Imagine one of the most expensive hotels in the world, with its marble floors and gold-leaf ceilings, filled with powerful men sleeping on thin mattresses in the ballroom. Some of them were eventually released after reaching financial settlements with the state. Filings later showed the government recovered roughly $100 billion in cash and assets from the sweep. This move served two purposes. First, it filled the state coffers at a time when oil prices were still struggling. Second, it sent a clear message to the old guard. There is only one center of power now. The days of competing royal factions were over. The prince had consolidated total control over the economy and the military. For international investors, it was a double-edged sword. They liked the idea of a corruption-free environment, but they were spooked by the sheer unpredictability of such a massive, sudden crackdown. Analysts still argue about whether these top-down social reforms are sustainable without a matching political opening. There is a real disagreement on whether you can give people Hollywood movies and driving licenses while still maintaining a strict, absolute monarchy. Some argue that as the population becomes more educated and economically independent, they will eventually want a say in how the country is run. Others point out that for many young Saudis, the trade-off is worth it. They are getting the freedom to live a modern life, and that feels like enough for now. The tension of this cultural revolution is most visible in the labor market. For years, most of the private sector jobs in Saudi Arabia were held by foreign workers from places like India, Pakistan, and the Philippines. Meanwhile, young Saudis were waiting for cushy government jobs that didn't really exist anymore. The government introduced a policy called Saudization. They started forcing companies to hire locals for specific roles. Picture a high-end mall in Jeddah. 10 years ago, the person behind the counter was almost certainly a foreign worker. Today, it is almost certainly a young Saudi man or woman. This transition hasn't been smooth. Many businesses complain that locals didn't have the training or the work culture of the foreign laborers. But the government held firm. They increased the fees on foreign worker permits, making it more expensive to hire from abroad. It was a sink or swim moment for the Saudi youth. They were being forced to build the country they were going to inherit. One notable event that captured the collision of the old and the new was the first ever Fashion Week held in Riyadh. It was a modest affair by Paris standards, and the audience was limited, but the fact that it happened at all was a miracle to anyone who knew the country 10 years ago. It featured female models on a runway, in a country where women used to be required to wear the black abaya in all public spaces. The drama of this section isn't about war or oil prices, it's about the soul of a nation. The kingdom is trying to skip 3 generations of social evolution in less than a decade. You can see the friction in the family dinner conversations where the grandfather remembers the old ways and the granddaughter is planning her career in a tech startup. This social pivot is the soft infrastructure of the $2 trillion plan. You can build the tallest towers in the world and the fastest trains, but if your people aren't ready to live in a modern world, the towers will sit empty. The kingdom is gambling that it can create a new Saudi that is both deeply religious and hypermodern. It's a tightrope walk over a very deep canyon. If they fall, the whole economic plan goes with them. If they succeed, they will have redefined what an Islamic state looks like in the 21st century. But as with everything in this story, the cost of entry was high and the path back is already blocked. As we head toward the final chapters of this decade, the grand $2 trillion vision is facing its most difficult test: reality. If you were to walk through the financial districts of Riyadh today, you'd notice that the initial gold rush energy has shifted into something more calculating and cautious. The gleaming skyscrapers are there, and the coffee shops are full, but the when and how of the plan are starting to weigh heavily on everyone involved. The kingdom is entering the delivery phase, and this is where the math starts to get very, very real. The biggest challenge isn't a lack of ambition, it's a lack of outside partners willing to put their own skin in the game. For Vision 2030 to truly work, Saudi Arabia needed more than just its own oil money. They needed foreign direct investment, or FDI. The plan was to have global corporations pouring billions into Saudi factories, tech hubs, and tourism. But if you look at the actual numbers, that tidal wave of foreign cash has been more of a slow trickle. Imagine you're a CEO of a major European manufacturing firm. You love the idea of zero taxes and the government-built infrastructure. But then you look at the geopolitical risks. You look at the anti-corruption sweeps and the sudden changes in regulations. You start to wonder if your investment is safe if the wind blows a different direction tomorrow. This hesitation has forced the Public Investment Fund to shoulder almost the entire burden itself. Instead of being a catalyst, the PIF has become the only engine in the car. This has led to a fascinating and tense situation in the Saudi banking sector. Because the government needs so much cash to keep NEOM, the sports leagues, and the new airlines running, they have started leaning on local banks. Reports at the time showed that the government was essentially sucking up all the available liquidity in the country. Picture a local entrepreneur in Jeddah. He wants a loan to expand his small logistics business. But when he goes to the bank, the interest rates are sky high, or the bank simply says no. Why? Because the bank would rather lend that money to a massive, government-backed mega project that is too big to fail. This is the unintended consequence of a top-down revolution. By trying to build a new economy, the state risks crowding out the very private businesses it's trying to encourage. It's a classic economic trap. Meanwhile, the global energy market is not waiting for the kingdom to finish its makeover. The transition to green energy is accelerating. While oil demand hasn't peaked yet, the world is getting much better at using less of it. This creates a terrifying pincer movement for the Saudi budget. They need oil prices to stay high, ideally above $80 a barrel, to fund the pivot away from oil. But if they keep the price too high, they accelerate the world's shift toward electric vehicles and renewables. It is the ultimate catch-22. Finance people still go back and forth on whether the kingdom can actually finish everything it started. If you look at the sheer list of projects, the world's largest airport, a new national airline called Riyadh Air, a massive theme park called Qiddiya, and the dozens of luxury resorts, it's clear that some things might have to be scaled back. In early 2024, a quiet but significant shift occurred. Reports began to leak that the timelines for the line at NEOM were being adjusted. Instead of 9 million people by 2030, the new targets were much more modest. This was a reality check moment. It showed that even with a $2 trillion checkbook, you eventually run into the limits of labor, materials, and time. A specific microscene from an earnings call with a global construction firm captures this tension perfectly. The CEO is being grilled by analysts about their Saudi contracts. He talks about rescoping and phased delivery. In corporate speak, that often means the client is running out of cash or realizing they can't build everything at once. The dream of a 110-mile mirrored city is starting to meet the reality of how long it actually takes to pour that much concrete. But it's not all doom and gloom. If you look at the non-oil GDP, the numbers are actually moving in the right direction. For the first time, tourism is becoming a real part of the economy. You can now go to a music festival in the desert that attracts hundreds of thousands of people. You can visit the ancient tombs of Hegra, which were closed to the world for decades. One notable event that proved the potential of this new economy was the 2023 Riyadh season. It was a massive entertainment festival that reportedly generated billions in revenue and created thousands of seasonal jobs. It showed that the Saudi people are more than willing to spend their money at home if the options are there. The leakage of wealth to Dubai and London is finally starting to slow down. However, the drama remains. The kingdom is currently in a race against its own demographics. With a massive youth population, the pressure to create high-paying, future-proof jobs is immense. If the mega projects fail to become self-sustaining hubs of industry, the government will be left with a series of very expensive, very beautiful white elephants in the desert. The outcome of this $2 trillion bet will define the 21st century for the entire Middle East. If Saudi Arabia succeeds, it will provide a blueprint for how a resource-rich nation can modernize without losing its identity. If it fails, the instability could ripple across the global economy for decades. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the clock is down to the final minutes of the first half. As we look toward the horizon, the image of that silent desert we started with is gone. In its place is a landscape of cranes, stadiums, and digital billboards. The black gold that built the past is being traded for a future that is still being written. Whether you think it's a visionary masterstroke or a massive hubris-filled gamble, you have to admit one thing. The world has never seen anything quite like this. The story of the $2 trillion pivot is a story about the limits of money and the power of will. It's about a nation trying to change its DNA while the whole world watches from the front row. We are witnessing the birth of a new kind of superpower, or perhaps the most spectacular what if in history. Only time and the price of a barrel of oil will tell. It's a lot to process, isn't it? Seeing a country try to rewrite its entire history in just a few short years really makes you think about how much the world is changing. I'm curious to hear what you think about all this. Do you think a city like NEOM will actually be a place people want to live in? Or is it just a massive sci-fi dream? And honestly, I'd love to know where you're watching this from. Are you sitting in a quiet office in the States, or maybe somewhere closer to the action in the Middle East? How is the economy looking in your neck of the woods right now? We're all feeling these global shifts in different ways, whether it's at the gas pump or in the job market. And I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments. If you enjoyed diving into the deep end of this $2 trillion gamble with me, it would mean a lot if you could hit that like button. It really helps the channel out more than you know. And if you want to keep exploring these kinds of stories, the ones where big money meets big risks, make sure you subscribe and turn on those notifications. We've got a lot more ground to cover together. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I'll see you in the next one.